This is World to Win, bringing you the latest news and analysis from a socialist perspective.
Hi everyone, and welcome to another episode of World to Win. Of course, you know the spiel by now. Please subscribe to our channel and also follow us on social media. And don't forget that we're also on every podcast platform known to man. So also follow us on there. If you don't want to, watch the video, you can always listen to us on there. So this episode is something that both me and Toya have been looking forward to so much. We're going to talk about, we've had episodes before about kind of LGBTQ plus rights, but now we're going to focus specifically on, I think, one of the most talked about issues to do with the gay community, which is trans rights. And it's quite topical with the International Transgender Day of Remembrance that happened a couple of weeks ago. I think one of the most disgusting stats that came out of that day was there was the most violent year for trans people. And it seems like every year is becoming the most violent year for trans people. So it's really important that we talk about this today. So I want to say, first of all, hello to Toya. How are you doing?
I'm good, Yara. Pardon my work attire. I just got off work, but I was too excited to even take time to shower to talk to you about this episode today. We've been chatting, me and you, about what's going on. I don't want to give away too much, but we've been chatting for so long about this, so I'm really excited for today's episode.
Yeah, and I feel like it's exactly the right time to talk about this because there's so much going on, I think, in popular culture as well about trans rights and a lot of transphobia kind of bubbling underneath the surface. So I'm really looking forward to hear kind of our position on that, but also kind of just have a chat about how horrendous it's been for trans people in the last few years. So in order to do that, we've got our guests for today. So we're going to say hello to Marie from the US section of International Socialist Alternative. How are you doing, Marie?
I'm doing great. I'm really happy to be here. I watch the show every week.
We love it. I think in the last few weeks we've had a few people who said that, and I'm so excited to always get the messages after being like, oh my god, it's so great to see it and stuff like that. So it's really good. So I was wondering if you can tell us a little bit about what you've been doing this week as well.
Yeah. So I've been in for the past couple months. I've actually been in Europe, which is really exciting. I'm from New York, but I came out here for, you guys have already talked about COP26 on the show a lot because I saw it, but I came out here for that. We had this huge mobilization of 300 members of our organization, along with just 100,000 other people out there really fighting for what the next steps are for the climate movement. And it's been exciting. I've gotten to spend a lot of time in Scotland because obviously, we don't just go to protests like that just to pressure release valve and then we go home, right? We're constantly trying to figure out what are the next steps for organizing these movements. And so I've gotten to do a little bit of aftermath of really meeting with people in Scotland who we met through COP26 and figuring out what the next steps are for organizing and spreading socialist ideas all over the UK and all over the world.
That's awesome, Marie. So jealous the two of you got to go to the COP26 mobilization, but glad to have you back in the US. But let's get started. So before we kind of get into, this huge encompassing topic, maybe a lot of people aren't aware of some of the things that Yara was saying about, statistics showing the alarming increase in violence against trans people, against intersex people, against gender non-conforming people, on a global level. So can you talk, Marie, a little bit about what you think is causing this to be such a crisis?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of horrifying in a way, right? Because they had these reports listed about what Yara was saying, just a deadly year it was for trans people. And this isn't something that's isolated to one country, right? There are certain areas of the world where it's more sharply seen, specifically in Brazil, I think 33% or some horrifying statistic of trans murders happen there specifically. There's this mass increase of hate crimes, of violence, of literal murder of trans people all over the world. In some places it's a bit more sharply seen, but I think what you're seeing right now in a lot of weird ways, it's kind of a weird contradiction, because at the same time, in some places, this is one of the best times actually to be out as a trans person, like in historical memory, right? Like there's more acceptance, there's more, you can go out and get medical care that you need, right? You can go out and like, you know, people like understand what being trans is in a way that like hasn't been seen before. And at the same time, we're actually seeing like the most violence on record, and not just like violence, but we're also seeing like, you know, in a lot of countries, like really sharp like anti-trans legislation. You're seeing like crackdowns in China around like celebrities that are even like slightly like gender variant, for example. Like it's not even just limited to like explicitly trans people. We're seeing like there's this really sharp polarization in society, and on the one hand, we're seeing like a world where people have more space to be freer than they ever had, and on the other hand, you're seeing like this really like serious right-wing reaction where people are really trying to like stir up I think a lot of the like reactionary ideas in society that are against like you know, LGBT identities, like homophobia, transphobia. You see this a lot throughout the US, where you see these like right-wing politicians who really come in and like try and polarize the issue, right? That like trans people are these people who are like invading our bathrooms or invading our sports teams, right? Often these are attacks against like youth, for example, and like really sharply also against like trans.
That's like the saddest thing to me is the bathroom issue. Like, Yara, yeah. I don't know if you guys have this in the UK, but like in many school districts in the US, there's like a battle for trans children to be able to use the bathroom that they want to use. And it's insane. Like I saw this great TikTok today, actually, that was talking about it. And it's like the idiocracy about the bathroom. And the person was like, everyone at your house uses the same bathroom, so why do you care which bathroom you use at school? And it was just like a perfect, like simplified way to say how ridiculous it is. But Marie, like, why are we seeing this when we have a new administration come in that says that, you know, society is going to be safer for trans people, for non-binary people? Why are we seeing these sort of reactionary bills saying, you know, trans kids can't play sports and they can't use the bathroom? Like, what's that about?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, that ties really heavily into that kind of like political polarization I was talking about, right? Because the new administration, right, we've had a year now of the Democrat in the U.S. of like this like Democratic majority that like supposedly, you know, a year and a half ago when we were voting for like a new president, people had said like, oh, if we like usher in like a Biden administration, right, this is gonna be a much safer place for trans people. But really, it's only gotten worse in the past year, right? And I think so. Yeah, I think like what the Biden administration was able to do is like reverse some of like the most like low hanging fruit of like super reactionary policy. You know, like some things in the last administration, for example, had like gone to like changing like rules around like whether or not trans people can be like discriminated against in like a doctor's appointment, right? Some like just blatantly like horrifying things. But at the end of the day, like what the Democratic administration isn't able to put forward really is like serious systemic changes that actually fit like where these attacks are like most sharply expressed, which is around like questions of like access to healthcare, which is around questions about like access to affordable housing, right? Which is something that trans people and like queer people generally are so often like completely excluded from being able to access.
Yeah, and you know, like in the UK, even though there is a nationalized healthcare system, there's still incredibly long queues to do anything to do with gender services. And even, you know, the services that do exist, even if you can only reach them 2 years after you've applied, they're going through endless litigation and kind of like court battles with the far right. With like lawyers who are also opposing abortion, trying to pretend like, you know, the very few cases of people who regret taking hormones or anything like that should stop access to healthcare for trans people. And there's this notion that, you know, I think also exists, like you said, it's not just the far right that's opposing it. It's you know, even the most kind of like semi-liberal figures like, you know, J.K. Rowling are talking about trans issues like they're kind of like in opposition to women's rights. And there's this kind of notion that, you know, trans people are trying to, you know, make all children trans and like giving them hormones in secret and things like that, which is ridiculous because it's so difficult to even start this process in the first place, even when it is accessible, that it ends up not being accessible. But I was wondering what you thought about kind of this whole wave of TERFs or like liberals who, you know, maybe should, in kind of like, if you look at logic, should support trans rights, but end up saying that, you know, these are fake women who are only there to rape women. What do you think about that?
I think it's absolutely disgusting. Like, I mean, yeah, there's like this whole idea about like the trans agenda, right? Like what transgender people are trying to do, like invade women's spaces, right? And it's this sort of like weird thing that happens where like these figures, it's like clearly a reactionary movement, right? It's a completely divisive movement that I think completely points away from like the sort of things that like not only would help trans people, but also would help cis women as well, right? Like access, like things like access to medical care. Like when we talk about things like, you know, there's a lot of this idea about like trans women are going to invade women's spaces. Like you see this conversation sometimes around like women's shelters, for example, as if like these are like, I think where it points away from is this idea that like these are like resources that are like these like scarce things because they have been in certain ways, and like it sort of appeals to that sort of sense of like scarcity where it's like we need to protect these things, like these are being invaded. It calls on these like really serious concerns that people have who may have been like sexually assaulted, right? Where like people want to defend these things, but unfortunately like it masks this really reactionary, like prejudiced sort of worldview around the language of like around like woke language, right? It sounds like feminism, like it sounds like, oh, we're defending the rights of women, right? But on the other hand, like I just think I think that it points away from like why, like I don't like, why is the conversation like around defending like what little like space we have when we could have this like serious like solidarity between cis women, between queer people, between people, all sorts of people about expanding these services, right? A massive expansion of these services that would benefit all people. But
I think the point that you're making now is super important, and I think it's also like really connecting to another huge kind of outrage that happened recently with Dave Chappelle's Netflix special. And I actually just watched it just for the purpose of this episode. And there's an outrageous point there that he's making, saying that the fight, basically kind of alluding to a point that the fight against kind of trans people is in the interests of black people. And he's saying that that being trans is like doing blackface, which obviously is outrageous. But I think what you're saying here is exactly the answer to all of these horrendous claims that, and I'm going to call them jokes, but they're not funny even if they weren't offensive, about kind of like how like the solidarity that needs to exist between all of the oppressed groups is instead utilized in order to separate us even more.
I'm glad that you finally seen the Chappelle special, Yara, because when I saw it, I was sitting in a room with a group of friends, and we were black women and many of us queer, and it was very interesting to see the range of reaction to the different types of jokes, and like it was interesting to me to see even the divisions within that group of people on like what it's okay to laugh at, even within the queer community. And it was actually kind of heartbreaking, but the Chappelle special, I think, is just a perfect example of how different oppressions are acceptable to, make jokes of until we actually build a movement to fight back against that, because there was a time where they did do things like blackface. And that comparison is ridiculous, because why did they do blackface? It was because they refused to hire black actors, that's why they did blackface. But there was a movement
to fight back against racism. And that is exactly what we need to fight back against transphobia and against homophobia. And some people who work at Netflix were attempting to do that. Did you guys hear about the walkout that happened a couple months ago?
Yeah, that was an incredible moment, I think. I honestly, to be honest with you, I haven't even seen the Dave Chappelle special. I've seen his like. Okay, great. I've seen his past stuff, and it hasn't been good. And I think what was really exciting about like the Netflix walkout, because I was glued to that, right, is like, yeah, it wasn't even just in reaction to like these terrible jokes you were making, which was a huge issue to begin with, right? But you had like trans like people that worked at Netflix like tweeting about like their discomfort with the kind of ideas that Netflix was like promoting and profiting off of. And Netflix actually suspended them for like standing up for their own like having like some amount of self-respect and being able to like broadcast that. And I think what's so good, I think like what the Netflix like walkout points to, I think, is the sort of action that we need to really like see serious changes on these fronts. I think it's like really like in a lot of ways it's this idea that we're seeing in a lot of ways, like through this massive strike wave that's happening, right? Where I think people are really starting to understand like what a powerful tool like withholding our own labor can be. And like the fact that this is being tied, I think, to like questions of oppression, to questions of prejudice, to questions of like to questions of like these disgusting like, jokes, which I've heard like aren't even like particularly jokes, like saying like, oh, I'm on team terf, right?
Marie, so many of my coworkers, when I was talking to them about the Chappelle show, they asked me what that means because, the word feminist is in that. So can you talk a little bit about what the term terf actually means?
It's like an acronym. So it stands for Trans Exclusionary Radical Feminist, which is this idea that like you can be radical or a feminist and not be for the rights of trans people. I think that, this is especially an issue in like the UK, for example. Like we were talking about, I literally, when I was campaigning in Glasgow around like the 25th of November, the International Day against, violence against women, I had, somebody told us that like you can't be a socialist, you can't call yourself a socialist and also support trans rights, which is just this absurd idea that like, yeah,
that's crazy.
Yeah, no, it's completely wild and completely counter to like the kind of movement that a supposed socialist should be wanting to build. But there's this idea that somehow like trans people trying to like assert themselves runs counter to like the rights of women. That somehow like if we extend this ability of people to be able to say who they are, like as a person, to be able to really say who you are and live your life the way that you want to live your life and the way that makes you the most comfortable and like makes you like the safest and happiest that you can possibly be, that somehow that is infringing on like the gains that like, or the struggles or the fights that like cis women have been throughout history, as if these things are in any way like, opposed to each other, which they're really not at all. I mean, as I've already said, like these are completely interlinked issues, right? The source of transphobia and the source of misogyny are like, historically like intertwined. You can't separate these things.
Yeah, I think that's like really, I think especially when we're talking about kind of the walkouts and all of that, I think an impressive part of these walkouts, and I think it's also something that we're seeing across the board now of workers showing solidarity with each other. I think one of the most impressive parts about the walkouts was that it wasn't just trans workers coming out. It was loads and loads of workers coming out in solidarity. And that's exactly the kind of solidarity that we need, like compared to the kind of like semi-solidarity and semi-woke language that Chappelle was talking, saying that, Black people look at trans people and say, well, they haven't suffered as much as we did. Instead of that, going out together and fighting together for everyone's rights is so important. And I think that when we talk about kind of walkouts and when we talk about kind of like movements to fight back, and interestingly enough, Dave Chappelle actually mentions Stonewall as like the type of gay that he likes, which is obviously outrageous. But I think it's so ingrained, even in the mainstream, even in people like Dave Chappelle, that Stonewall was a heroic movement. So I was wondering if you can like explain, first of all, what is kind of like Stonewall in the first place, but also why does it speak to people so deeply even today, decades after it?
Yeah, first of all, I didn't know that he said that. I think that's really disgusting. I think especially when you see how these attacks on trans people so disproportionately also affect trans people of color. And I think also discussing, these aren't separate questions. Not that we should ever play this sort of oppression Olympics thing, but these aren't separate questions, right? And I think looking back at Stonewall, what Stonewall was, right, was this huge rebellion that launched in New York City in the late 60s, primarily led again by queer people of color, against this stateless, it was this moment that took place in a gay bar in New York City, one of the few places where LGBT people could go to be a part of the community, to be with other LGBT people. But at the same time, they frequently have these police raids because a lot of gay bars at the time were run by the mafia, essentially. So once a month, the police would come, line everybody up, harass people, make people uncomfortable, assault people, arrest people. And then there was this moment in 1969 where people were no longer going to sit here and accept their own repression, right? They were no longer just going to allow this to happen. There was this huge uprising where people came from all over the city to stand up against these arrests that were happening of LGBT people at the Stonewall Inn in the West Village, and it was just this massive catalyst for just a whole wave beyond that of radical organizing for queer rights. I mean, it was really it wasn't the first iteration of the queer movement by any means. This is something that's been happening for a long time, right? But when we think about when we talk about Pride, for example, right? Pride itself has its origin in Stonewall, right? Prior to the Stonewall Rebellion, there were about 50 or so LGBT rights groups. A year after Stonewall, according to a participant or according to an early LGBT activist, there were 1,500 LGBT rights groups. People seized on this moment to really organize for queer rights and to really bring out these massive radical marches that even brought out serious explicitly anti-capitalist demands, calling for a better world and calling for the advancement of rights of LGBT people.
What are though, when you say anti-capitalist demands in regards to queer liberation, what does that mean specifically? And you said there were 50 some odd organizations back then, which is amazing, and we don't see that today. But do we still see that anti-capitalist edge in the queer liberation movement?
Yeah, so I mean, to talk about the radical anti-capitalist ideas that were happening at that time, right? I think what really distinguished Stonewall from the things that happened before it, and what distinguishes the movement that followed it, right, is the fact that it was happening in the wake of the civil rights movement, of these massive revolutionary movements internationally. And immediately after that, the entire consciousness that had developed around all these different movements, really fighting against oppression, fighting against the system, fighting for the advancement of the working class. It's, you can't really separate cleanly the issues, right? One of the organizations that sort of developed following the Stonewall Rebellion, the Gay Liberation Front, was a huge organization that organized for LGBT rights in the U.S. There was also a Gay Liberation Front in the UK, for example, that actually was founded because the founding members had met other LGBT activists in the U.S. following Stonewall at a Black Panther conventional conference or something like that. So these are serious struggles against oppression were all interlinked at the time. Yeah, and so the entire consciousness around this came around to this huge uprising that we could no longer accept. It came down the question of whether or not we should be allowed to exist in society as LGBT people. Ultimately came down to a question also of what kind of society we want to be living under to begin with.
And I think the points that you're making about kind of the historical context and the fact that it was during the civil rights movement and all of that, I think is really important, because it seems on the one hand, people like Dave Chappelle try to separate Black people from trans people, forgetting that there's also a lot of trans people of color. But then you have the other side, the J.K. Rowlings, who are kind of trying to separate trans people from the rest of the gay community, or trans people from women, forgetting that, you know, it was only a few decades ago where the same arguments that they're using against trans people were used against gay people, saying, you know, the gays are trying to convert children and all of that, and the danger about the gay community. And I think that that's kind of like one of these things that these reactionaries are just repeating the same arguments over and over and over again. But at the end of the day, we are seeing that the history of trans rights and the queer community generally is a history of radical struggle. And I was wondering, and like you said, it was also like not just radical, you know, organization against oppression, but also recognizing the connection between capitalism and gender-based oppression, and, you know, oppression based on sexuality as well. So do you think that this exists in the movement today as well, or have we moved beyond that and now we're just looking for, you know, rainbow capitalism?
I mean, there's a huge movement right now against rainbow capitalism, I think. I mean, there's absolutely, I mean, you know, and it's not as if like this is ancient history. Like, certainly there are activists that were a part of these movements that are still active today, but also like there's an entirely new generation, I think, of LGBT activists that really want to reclaim like the radical memory of the origins of Pride, right? For example, in New York City, you know, for so long, like what started out as like the Christopher Street Liberation Day Parade, what became like the early like Pride marches that were these like big radical like marches, you know, over time got overtaken by like corporate interests. Like there are these bank floats. Like if I wanted to, as like a working class queer person, you know, at the time I was working at Starbucks, like when I first came out, if I wanted to be a part of like the Pride March, I had to essentially like sign up to like march with Starbucks at like Pride, right? It was no longer like what it had started out to be. But I think there's this really like healthy movement happening right now where, for example, the past few years in New York City, there's been the Queer Liberation March. Last year, actually, during the BLM movement, that you know had like gripped the world at the time, they actually organized the Queer Liberation March to be specifically like the Queer Liberation March for Black lives and against police brutality, right? So you do see this today, that there is this important impulse to like want to like revisit these traditions. I think specifically like what needs to be debated out within our movements is exactly like what are the demands that we're fighting for, and also like what what is missing, I think, from this is this like explicitly socialist consciousness, like this explicitly like socialist like wing of the movement that wants to like really address where the roots of transphobia, misogyny, racism are, how they're rooted in our class society, and like what exactly is like the direction that this movement needs to go to overcome these things.
Well, and that's what I'm always like telling people when we're talking about how we can fight for a better society, is like the inherent connection that we all have, regardless of what community that we're in. I mean, like something that, you know, is a big issue, especially in the US for trans people, is access to healthcare, because like it's so incredibly expensive. But like as a cisgendered person, I would benefit from access to healthcare. And so why would we not join up together to fight for healthcare for all? You know, we don't want to just fight for healthcare for one section of society. We want it for everyone. You know, you could take that with housing discrimination. You could take that with job discrimination, which, I mean, in the US and many states, it's still legal for employers and landlords to discriminate based on sexuality, et cetera, which is just crazy to think about. But, you know, what do you think, Marie, when it comes to cisgendered people or non-trans people, what role do they have to play in the fight for queer liberation?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think that everybody, I think that all working people, all oppressed people have like a really serious, as you're saying, like a really serious role to play in like just the interlinked nature of like all of our struggles. Right? Because honestly, as like you all know, Toya, like we live in a society like the capitalist system, which, you know, thrives on this like divide and conquer strategy of working people that like wants us to think that we're like more different than we actually are, that like our struggles aren't connected, that like the same demands that like would help the lives of trans people, wouldn't help the lives of every single person, right? Full access to like trans inclusive Medicare for all, right? Affordable public housing, like that's, you know, permanently affordable, high quality, right? These are like important demands that I think can be taken up, that like that benefit all people. So all people, like the thing is, all people can move into this action. The thing is, I feel like in order to actually affect serious change, what I think is like a positive thing about that like Netflix example that we talked about earlier is like how much like the working class as an organized force could have like a serious impact on like actually achieving some of these things. And I think in order to like kind of heal those divisions, right, this idea that like these are separate struggles, right, I think in a lot of ways like the role that like all working people can play is like in fighting for these like serious like democratic organizations where we can like talk about like what the path is forward, like what are the demands we're fighting for, and use those to seriously like take up like explicitly the demands of queer people, the issues that like will positively like impact the lives of queer people, in order to like unite these struggles and like bring these into something that can actually literally change society, I think. But in order to do that, that's a huge task, right? We need everybody on the same page.
Yeah, and at the end of the day, what you're saying, like what you said before, is exactly that. Like the origin of the oppression of queer people is the same root of the oppression of women, and in a slightly more distant way, also the root of the oppression based on race or ethnicity and based on class. So if the root is the same, then we have to fight together, because we also, it's not just the method is what's the like is the way to dismantle it, but also it's in everyone's interest to fight against the system, because our oppression, no matter what kind of oppression it is, no matter what kind of exploitation it is, comes down to the capitalist system. It comes down to the way that like the class system had to kind of put limits and repress and regulate our sexuality, so that there wouldn't be just random babies flowing around, and they would know who to put inheritance forward to. And that's also connected to the way that gender is completely separated, not just the way that women are oppressed, but also the way that marriage is supposed to be a very certain thing of man and woman, and gender it has to be binary, and all of that is connected to the origin of class society. So it's kind of like very logical that we would not just fight together because that's the way to break the system, but also because the system oppresses all of us based on it.
Yeah, 100%. Like that's exact. I mean, that's exactly like what the power of like uniting like for these like immediate battles, right, sort of like points towards, right, is because I think once we like understand our collective power, once we've like started to organize under these organizations of like the working class and the oppressed to like actually seriously like try and fight to overcome these things, I think what we can point towards is an overcoming of like the very like foundation of like this like horrible system that is like that like leads to transphobic violence, right? That leads to all the things that you're saying, right? And I think ultimately what we need to usher in is like a socialist society, one that's not like based on like profit, one that's not based on inequality, right? And only through doing that can we really like permanently like stop these like defensive battles, right, against just defending our livelihood, and like actually like fight for a society where like people can thrive, right? Where like the question is no longer like, how do I like, is it safe for me to like walk down the street as a trans person and like go to the store, where the question, where I can live like a fully like a life full of like self-respect and like dignity in a society where I don't have to worry about like rising rent costs, where I don't have to worry about like how I'm going to make my next paycheck, where I don't have to worry about like how I'm going to afford my hormones at the end of the month, right? And this is the sort of society that I think like the masses of organized like working people, poor and oppressed, can like usher in through our like own shared struggle.
Yeah, Marie, I think a lot of people actually don't realize what you were just explaining. Like when we're talking about the need to fight for trans rights, it's because the problems of capitalism and the problems of our society are exacerbated. you talked about access to healthcare. I've heard stories of people being denied healthcare because of being trans. Hormones, like you're talking about, being able to afford them, but even like rising rents. Okay, so rents, rise like crazy, which causes homelessness. Homelessness for trans people is very dangerous. And like we were mentioning before, if we say that trans women can't go to a women's shelter, well, then what are they to do? It's like the problems of our society are more exacerbated. Or, as you mentioned, is it safe for me to walk down the street? Like, because of the violence against trans people. So like, society is always changing, right? We talked a little bit today about how working class organizations help us to push demands forward. Building a movement is how we really can build change, not just like Yara said the term rainbow capitalism, which, some of those demands of the Netflix walkouts were kind of part of rainbow capitalism, right? Like some of the demands were like more trans executives, right? Like, okay, cool. That's great for those people, but that's not helping the overwhelming majority of people. We do need to build working class organizations, like, we talk about every week, to fight for demands, to build movements so that we can win real change, to ultimately fight against capitalism. But, there is still a lot of hate out there from individuals. What can we do about that? Is that just inherent? Like, how are we going to be able to make an actual safe world for all oppressed people, through fighting for these demands?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that these transphobic ideas are in any way inherent to society, right? Of course, I mean, you have like individuals who hate, trans people, right? But the fact is I mean, these ideas are like the way that like especially the right wing like really tries to capitalize on like issues of transphobia or like issues of homophobia, for example, I think is really seriously baked into our system. And the fact is throughout history, like there's this like idea that like these things have moved in a straight line. Like the fact is they haven't. There have been like ebbs and flows in like how people like understand trans people. If you look at like Berlin and like the very, very early 1900s, right? A time when I think a lot of people think like, trans people didn't exist back then. Like you'll hear that. Like there was a thriving trans community and like an institute that actually like did a ton of like medical research on trans people, or like for the benefit of trans people. And that was wiped out obviously by like, the Nazi party coming into power, this like far right party that like, again, like you see today, like wanted to like whip up this serious wave of reaction in order to capitalize on that. And like, and trans people were like one of the groups that they took that out on. And the fact is like by ushering in the new society, we're like, I think we're like these, I think by creating like a society based on like shared solidarity between working people and the oppressed, the basis in our society for these like right-wing forces to really take hold, right? These like individual ideas about like I'm uncomfortable with these people can't be like used in the same way to develop into this like organized force of reaction. We can work to eliminate the basis for that to develop to begin with.
I really like this example, and I think that, it is something that keeps repeating that like trans is a new thing, but it's not. And it's not just not a new thing, it's something that's existed forever. And if we do want to talk about, people of color and different cultures than European culture, a lot of cultures have those like ideas of non-binary genders ingrained in their culture as well. So pretending like it's a thing of the last few decades and, other types of oppression are older, so we should put more emphasis on them, is just, it has no basis in reality. And I really, really agree with what you're saying about kind of the cases of, because I think it's what is a natural human thing is to, maybe feel a bit uncomfortable about things that you haven't encountered before. But but it's not like there's an inherent fear of trans people. It's just because our society forces trans people to hide the way that they feel and to feel bad about themselves as well. And that's what our society is doing about every single kind of group of oppressed people, to separate them and to kind of make them outsiders, so that there will be this kind of divide and rule that will stop us from coming in solidarity together and fighting against the system that divides us in the first place. So I think that's really, really true. And I really enjoy this episode as well. Like, obviously, I wanted to record it for a really long time, and Toya did too, but I think this was really, really fascinating. And I also really enjoyed having this conversation generally. So thank you so much for being here, Marie. And I'm sure that, this episode is going to be so helpful, because the trans movement is growing. And every year we're seeing more and more kind of protests and more kind of movements growing around the world around it. So I think this episode is going to help us kind of, first of all, put our ideas forward, but also intervene in these movements and be kind of knowledgeable about what we're talking about. So thank you so much for being here, and really hope to see you again on an episode soon.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's been a really good conversation.
This is World to Win. Every Sunday, we broadcast with speakers from across the globe, bringing you the latest news and analysis on the fast-moving global events from a socialist perspective. Subscribe to the International Socialist Alternatives YouTube page and click the bell to get notified when we go live for a new episode. Like us on Facebook and follow us on Instagram, because there's a lot to do and we have a world to win.
When we fight! When we fight! When we fight! Solidarity!